Ailments are a powerful tool in Titan Quest 2, and they can be rather complicated to understand, so let's go into the details on how this all works. And to make something very clear here, I will mostly talk about standard numbers. I know there are certain talents and passives and items you can find which can modify all those numbers and can basically add exceptions to the rules, but we will talk about the standard rules here, and I will mostly talk about bleeding, but please keep in mind that even though I'm focusing on bleeding, this basically counts for all the ailments in the game. There isn't really a big difference on how they work, so just because I'm saying bleeding a lot, this also counts for chilled, shocked, burning, plagued, weakness, and staggered, which are all the ailments. By the way, if you want to figure out your ailments, don't forget to go into the inventory of your character spreadsheet, then click on Advanced, and then scroll down till the ailments so that you can find the information there. But let's go. How does this work? Well, the first question you have is, how do I put ailments on the enemy? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You find an ability which specifically tells you, hey, I will put an ailment on the enemy. Or you find a corresponding ability. So let's say you are using a fire attack, then you have a pretty high chance to put burning as an ailment on the enemy. But how does that work for weapons? So interestingly enough, weapons can also create ailments depending on their percentage chance, right? And then, of course, the items you have on will also create a certain percentage chance. And far more important is the damage type. Every weapon is coming with at least one or multiple damage types, and every damage type has a chance to create a specific ailment. In this case, I'm using a spear with a very high pierce damage, so that means my spear is focusing on bleeding. Okay, so how does that work if I have multiple damage types on my weapon like you have here with the spear, right? You don't just have pierce damage, you also have strike damage on it. So what the weapon is doing and what the system is doing in the background is whenever you're attacking something, it would take the highest damage modifier on the weapon, and then it has a very high chance to use that damage modifier to create the corresponding ailment. So that means most of the time I will create a bleeding, but I still have a chance, even though it's a much lower one, to create stagger on the enemy because I have also strike damage. And what you really want to do is you want to focus mostly on two damage types on your weapons, and why that is we will talk about in a minute. But it also helps you to build those ailments much faster because you can go over 100%, right? When you're reaching 100%, you have 100% chance to create one stack of an ailment. If you're going above that, let's say 200 or 300%, then every attack will create 2 or 3 ailments of that corresponding type immediately. So what you want to do is you want to have a very high ailment chance when you are working with ailments. Okay, so now I know how to put that on the enemy, but how does it exactly work? So what we have to take a look at first is the stacks. When you attack an enemy, you can see a small number under the health bar, which is telling you how much stacks are there on the enemy already. And unfortunately, this is not quite accurate. The game is telling you that you have 1, 2, 3, 6, 10 stacks of a certain ailment, but that's not quite right. Let me give you an example so you understand this quickly. When you are attacking an enemy and you create an ailment stack, you have now 1 bleeding on the enemy. A second later, you attack again, and you will put 2 bleedings on the enemy. And the game will tell you, hey, you have now 3 bleedings on the enemy. That's not true. What you have is you have 1 bleeding, which is running for 2 seconds left, because every ailment, well, most ailments run at 3 seconds. They are staggered and weakness, which are running in 4 seconds. But most of the corresponding damage ailments run for 3 seconds, right? And so going back to that example, you have 1 ailment, which is now at 2 seconds, and you have 2 ailments of bleeding you just put on the enemy, which are running at 3 seconds. So even though the game is telling you that you have a certain amount of stacks on them, they are not one bleeding stack. They are multiple different stacks with multiple different damage values and multiple different timers. So this is why it is so important to get basically as many stacks with one attack on the enemy as possible, because then it doesn't confuse you too much with how long this will run. And also it reduces the chance a little bit to have some bad damage values calculating into that. So yeah, you want to get as many ailment stacks as possible, because, well, then you have only used one attack to basically put that on the enemy. And again, it makes also your energy management, if you're using some skills for that, much easier, and so on and so forth. So there's a very important thing. Another thing which is also very important is, of course, to understand, now that those stacks are on the enemy, how many can I put there? Well, if you have already checked your ailments under the advanced tabs, you have already figured out that it says 10. So wait, does that mean I can just put 10 ailments of every ailment on the enemy? No. The max stacks for one ailment is 10. Again, there's some passive items which can change that. But the hard cap, no matter what, is 20. You are reaching 20 stacks of any given ailment. That's it. If you are now putting another ailment on the enemy, even though you already have 20 stacks of, let's say, bleeding and burning, then the game will take a few stacks away from the enemy, most of the time the one which is already running pretty low, and then we'll try to divert those stacks. So let me just give you an example here. If you were trying to put 4 ailments on the enemy, you would probably run with 5 ailments each. And that's really not what you want, right? This is why I can only tell you, try to focus on 2 ailments at maximum. Or maybe even 1, depending on how high you can get the maximum stack of an ailment, and you just want to focus on that. It also makes it a little bit easier to get the damage number up, because you only have to focus on 1 or 2 damage numbers, right? But I highly recommend not to go beyond 2 ailments, because, as I said, the maximum hard stack is 20. That's the cap, and you cannot change that. So the more different ailments you're putting on the enemy, you are losing out a lot of damage potential and a lot of things you can do. So don't do that. Speaking about damage, how does the damage work? So this is a little bit confusing, because it is very important to note that ailments only become more powerful with percentages which increase the ailment damage, or with specific abilities and passives which are saying, hey, your bleeding damage is getting increased, or your burning damage is increased, right? So that's very important to look for that. No spell damage is not increasing your ailment damage. Fire damage is not increasing your burning damage. That's also very important. And I will explain in a minute why that is. But so you really want to focus on your ailments. Another very important thing is, if you are finding an item which says, hey, this is increasing the damage over time effects, ailments are not damage over time effects. I know that's weird, and we will cover damage over time effects here also in a minute, but they are not the same thing. Very important to note. So the next thing I really have to highlight here is, when you finally have an ailment on the enemy, then you probably wonder what the damage is. Well, isn't that simple, Mole? What the ailment says. If it says bleeding, then it's bleeding damage. If it says burning, it's burning damage. No, it's actually all the same. What? Yeah. So even though it is burning or bleeding, the damage which is being done to the enemy, it's the same. It's pure damage. Or if you were an avid Warcraft 3/Dota 1 player, and I'm dating myself here, it's chaos damage. It's damage which cannot be evaded, which cannot be reduced, and it's just there. And every ailment is doing pure damage. This is why you really want to focus on items and stats which are increasing your ailment damage in general, or focus on, even though they are all doing the same damage type, when you have a passive which says, okay, this increases your bleeding damage, then the pure damage coming from bleeding is only being increased. Like, again, it gets a little bit convoluted here at the end. I know that. But it is really important to point out that probably the most important stat you want to focus on is ailment damage, because it increases the ailment on, well, all your ailments, and you don't really have to think about it too much. Also very important, a lot of enemies have different resistances to ailments, and to make this clear again, resistances do not reduce damage of an ailment. It only checks if an ailment will be applied or not. So if you are winning that resistance check, you put an ailment on it. If you're failing, no ailment will be applied. But again, it doesn't reduce the damage. So now we have one last thing to cover, and that is damage over time effect. You've maybe already wondered, like, why is this not increasing by ailments? Because it's not the same thing. There is actually one damage over time effect right now in the game, and that is poison damage. It's a natural damage bonus, and it's a damage over time effect. Also very important, poison is not pure damage, it's poison damage. It runs for 3 seconds, and it cannot stack. So you can only do 1 poison dot on the enemy. It's basically a nature spell in this game. And yes, poison damage can create plague damage, and plague is an ailment again. So I know that can be very confusing sometimes, but that's how it works, right? Poison damage is your damage over time effect. It's not an ailment, but it can create an ailment. And that's how the ailment works in Titan Quest 2. If you still have some questions, let me know down below in the comments. I will try to answer them as quickly as possible when I can. And I hope it was helpful. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to leave a like. And also, if you're new to the channel, you want to see more Titan Quest 2 videos in the future, we are also focusing here on RPG games and survival games, then you might want to subscribe to the channel. With that said, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe. Bye-bye.